Fellowship of Akkad is just a waste of time because it's not substantial. It doesn't cut to the issues that really matter, particularly in Europe these days. And I'm done.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think the whole tolerance thing, that's actually a thing which we've seen a little bit and has been very telling at the whole VidCon drama bullshit, which I know is one of the things we want to do, but we don't really want to do, but we're going to do it anyway. I noticed there was a lot of, we apologized to the feminists who we've pointed out why they're wrong. It's like there was the Sargon Lacey, they had a cuddle and she cried and it was a human thing and it was beautiful, and MTV's Francesca Ranzi had a chat with Andy Worski and they hugged it out and they were like, yeah, well, maybe we can have a talk in the future and all this sort of stuff. And I'm looking at it, it's like, okay, this is all very nice and it's all very tolerant of you, but these people who you've been arguing against for years are still there's still zero personal accountability to the things that they've been saying before over all of the past years. You're literally just letting this stuff slide. And here's the other thing, it's like you're apologizing to them for what? Oh, because first of all, it's like, okay, you're apologizing for all of the bad shit that they've received. Okay, well, congratulations, you've completely reneged on your previous position of, I don't control my audience, I am not responsible for any bad shit that you get. If you're apologizing for that, then you are tacitly admitting that you had you were a piece in that instigation. You played a part in that sort of thing, which you're not. You don't control your audience. That's on them if that's what they want to do. So you're apologizing for it is a tacit admission that first of all, they have received all of the harassment and death threats, and second of all, it is the admission that you had something to do with it. And this, I think, is going to be part of the split that we see now. Because we've got the VidCon crowd who are now basically, and even they are now issuing their own videos where it's like, yeah, it's basically now undeniable that we have a community going on here, that we do absolutely have an in-group. And of course, I see that as basically being where the split is going to be. It's the in-group who went to VidCon and who apologized and for all of the wrongdoing, even though there was no wrongdoing. Literally, all they have done is point out why people are wrong. You don't have to apologize for doing that.
That's pretty obvious why, right? The Fellowship of Akkad they have a symbiotic relationship to people like Sarkeesian, right, or Lacey Green. I mean, they need each other to keep the status and shekels game going, basically. What are they gonna do if they sort of run out of batteries for that particular topic? So I think that might go a long way in explaining why they're apologetics. And I actually wasn't even aware that there'd actually, now that there's officially a community, I imagine the community is synonymous with the Fellowship of Akkad, with Lord Akkad at its head, as I understand it.
Well, this is going to be the thing over the next few weeks. I mean, there were people who beforehand vehemently denied that there was any sort of community, that there was any sort of in-group preference amongst these people. But then those same people would say, but these people are my friends. So it's like, okay, so you're friends with people, but you're not in a community with people. So you're friends with people, and you seem to think that means you have no sort of in-group identity with them. That means you're not going to have any sort of aversion to critics of those people because the critics are part of the out-group and thus, therefore, be wrong thinkers. You're not going to say, whenever you collaborate with all of these people, you're going to show no sense of, say, kin selection and reciprocal altruism insofar as, they have you on, so you better have them on, sort of, there's going to be no sort of unspoken things, anything like that at all. Sure thing. You go ahead and think you're immune to the basics of human psychology. Good job. You go ahead and you try and disprove that.
And the risk there, TLDR, not that I ever thought they were pursuers of truth and objective understanding to begin with, is that kinship, if you want to call this sort of kinship bias, this exists in the alt-right as well, and certainly in MGTOW. People are willing to subvert accurate data for the sake of agreement and agreeability, just sort of let's all get along, when the most accurate understanding is the most important thing. Take, and you lose that once you get into a quote-unquote community where everyone sort of necessarily needs to get along, and you have to make all kinds of concessions. The one concession you should not make is compromising accuracy and data and everything related to that. But that will also go by the wayside in a situation like that. So
yeah, it already has to a certain degree. I mean, there was the first sort of big drama, as it were, which was when Lacey Green had her hangout with Blair White all of those months ago. Now, I forced myself to watch the whole thing, And it was basically just like 2 and a bit hours of agreeing to disagree, and really nothing very productive came of it. And there was one thing which really stuck in my mind about it, and that was Blair brought up the 2% false rape allegation thing, and she brought up the fact that no, this is completely wrong. There is all sorts of data that demonstrates why this is wrong. There's numerous other studies done which suggest that it's higher. Anywhere, 2% is like the lowest figure that's been found. The highest was up to 98%, although that was a one-off study which had like 16 cases in it. So that one was probably more of an outlier than anything else. But generally, you're looking anywhere from 20 to 40%. And she was completely factually correct in that observation. But then Lacey's thing was, no, I've got FBI statistics that prove that this isn't the case. And I'll just give them to you afterwards, and then just sort of move it along to talk about other things. It's like, well, and then at that point there was sort of the agree to disagree. Now, as far as I'm aware, no exchange of information has taken place after that. And so it's like, well, in that case, a factual point has basically just fallen by the wayside for the sake of just kind of getting on with each other and not ruffling feathers, which I find to be very, very worrying.
Well, it's once again, there's the Fellowship of Akkad, and that community has a symbiotic relationship with the Lacey Greens and the I don't know, all these people, the feminists or the SJWs. They need each other. And so they're sort of like second cousins in a way. They have to pat each other on the back every now and then. Even Thunderfoot does this. I mean, he'll bring up ancient footage of Anita Sarkeesian, and well, he's been excommunicated too, I think. I don't follow this in great detail. You're much better versed in this than I am.
Oh, I wouldn't say so. I kind of ignored most of it.
True, though you've always had, if only informally, greater ties to that whole community. So they kind of need each other. It's in the same sense that the religionists and the atheists back in the day, when that was popular, needed each other. That eventually ran its course, and now we're in this new era, which, I don't know. I have my own theories. I think that effectively the Fellowship of Akkad and it's all just a form of populism, and one can test the waters. That there'll come a stage where, for example, it will become acceptable to say X, or for example, to say that maybe IQ matters, or mean differences in population, in genetic population, like you actually can be consequential. And then all of a sudden you'll see the quote-unquote skeptics and rationalists talk about it as if it were the sliced bread, the newest thing and the newest jam, and because it'll become acceptable. It's just that other groups have to sort of put it all through the meat grinder, talk about the unpopular things, and eventually, that's what I think is happening and will happen. I think that it's even possible that, because it becomes such a trend, that alt-rightism of the sort of typical sort as it stands now becomes a de facto position of the skeptic community, just because it becomes popular enough that that's where the shekels and the status reside. And so, the moderation thing will become a new sort of moderation thing.
Yeah, well, I think it's because things like the IQ averages, the population differentials, now I have no problem with talking about these things, I've brought them up before, but they're still somewhat a fringe thing. They're a little bit too on the fringe for other people to do at the moment.
For now.
Yes, and I do think that they are going to become the next thing, because the skepticism thing is based on the sort of, it's got to have edge to it. Like anti-feminism had an edge to it a few years ago because it was counter to the mainstream, and it's having less of an edge. Its edge is being dulled over time. It's being overused. So they're going to have to move on to the next like, slightly edgy thing. So what's the next slightly edgy thing? But you have to kind of wait until it's a little bit in vogue before you sort of take the plunge and go into it.
I think. Yeah, I think give it a year, maybe two, and that'll be sort of acceptable intellectual territory to talk about, and there'll be a whole new set of things that they can't talk about potentially.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just see this as they're like branches in the wind. Whatever, they'll go with the flow basically.
Yeah.
And then when it's acceptable, they will shift gears. Because let's face it, anti-feminism is not edgy anymore. It's not special. There's the drama aspect. People seem to love that, but eventually they're going to need some new substance. And it does follow a pattern. I mean, people were talking about the flaws of feminism years before the community existed, whether it was MGTOW or straight out MRAs. They just weren't very popular for all sorts of reasons: delivery, presentation, but also it just wasn't in. I think it's almost an inevitability that there'll be a shift. And I do think that the shift is going to move further and further in what people call the alt-right, even though I'm not alt-right myself. I do interact a fair bit with some of them, and I talk to them sometimes. And I think, whereas at the moment, the default or de facto position of the Fellowship of Akkad is alt-right is just stupid. Now, I think the alt-right is wrong about quite a number of things, but I don't just say, they're just stupid. So I'm not going to bother discussing things with them. And I think I think that will be the shift is if things continue, particularly in Europe, and that's the whole, really ultimately the reason why it's hard to take anything they say seriously, even regard them as people who want to affect some sort of change. Because by definition, if you're following trends, if trends are the powers that be for you, that dictate to you what is acceptable and not to say, irrespective of the evidence, well, why should I believe anything you say? If you're beholden to these mighty powers that we call trends, rather than good arguments and things that are just relevant, well, I could just dismiss you outright. I mean, you might make a relevant argument in that context, but there's definitely going to be a lot of skepticism I'm going to bring to the table when it comes to people of that sort. It's my view.
Yeah, well, this is something quite interesting. It is to do with the sort of overall community as it is. And that is the latest controversy, which seems to be, it's still kind of breaking in its early days.
I don't know.
I know it's, and I think it is going to be the women in the community and the shift in the shift in general attitude and whatnot, because some people are starting to address it. I think it's partly because I've sort of brought it up, and lots of people have noticed the same thing, and so now it's kind of like, it's got to be answered in some way. But I noticed that there's not people who are engaging with any sort of data to it. Now, I can present numerous studies on how the presence of women does objectively affect how men behave. In fact, I'm rapidly considering just making a video on it, just not bother linking it to anything, but just make a video on it and just kind of leave it there. But I noticed that because these people have this in-group, and if you say anything that is less than absolutely 100% positive about the women in the skeptosphere, the response is now, rather interestingly, you're mad, you're salty, you're jealous, you can't get laid. Really, that is what the responses seem to boil down to, and especially in Dave Cullen's video. That was one of the very distinct impressions that I got from it. It was basically like, oh, well, the only reason you'd have a problem with this is basically because you hate women and you want to hold a monopoly on things. It's like, well, that's an interesting one. I mean, it's been like 2 weeks since I last heard you're just mad because you're losing your privilege. Where did that argument come from? Let me guess, it wasn't an argument when the feminists did it, but now that you're doing it, now that you're doing it to defend your in-group, it's suddenly become an argument. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? So I think that's kind of going to be the new thing. And the thing is, it's such a third-rail issue. It's something that they don't want to talk about because then they would have to start actually dealing with, again, like sex-based differences. And I think a lot of them, because they do hold to the egalitarianism ideal, it's like, well, we'll take the differences when it suits us. Why are women underrepresented in certain things? Well, because of these objective differences. But when it comes to certain things like, well, do you think those differences might play into some sort of in-group, out-group dynamic or anything like that? The very notion of things like social identity theory, you belong to this group, so you want to see all of the good things in the group and ignore the bad things. I actually chalk social identity theory up to why these people were saying, like, up until a few days ago, there is no community. Because, when you say community, because a lot of them are very, very, like, pro-individualist, like, fiercely so. Well, so the idea if you say, oh, well, there is a community here, they've seen that word applied to things like the social justice community, and it instantly sort of brings up collectivism and judging people as groups, and we can't have that because that's bad, that's what we stand against, so we've got to deny that.
Well, I want to throw, this isn't my idea, so I'm going to give full credit to the guy. There's a guy named Coterie McTow, small channel, young guy, but quite bright. His analysis, he talked briefly about this in a recent video of something like the Fellowship of Akkad, is that it's not just community. The people that comprise the community, the acolytes, the followers, not just that, if you want to look at it hierarchically, you could say, Sargon's at the head, and then a guy like Computing Forever is a minion, there's some subordinate, and there are all these branches, but the subs, the patrons, they begin to identify themselves, this is his theory, with these people. So if you insult one of these guys, it's sort of an insult to everyone, and I think I would agree with him. I think that's an element of this, we're community. We're all sort of part of the Hydra, as it were.
Well, that is social identity theory. Yeah, that is the term for what he's describing there. It's the idea that, you have this sense of belonging, so anything negative said about something that you belong to is necessarily an insult at you. And that's why when I made the video, which I did, sort of saying, well, part of the reason that everyone's so eager to accept Lacey Green is partly because obviously she's female, so, that instantly gives you bonus points. But I think also that there is this business angle, and I find it very weird that people deny the business angle of YouTube throughout this. Because a lot of people were saying, well, look, she's got 1.5 million subs, we can expand our message out. So that's not a business thing. You're not siding with her because you want access to an audience of 1.5 million people, most of whom have probably never even heard of you. That there's not a business element to that at all? Really? Like, do you think your audience is just stupid, or do you think they're blind? Really? It's bizarre. And this, going on to this community point here, I still find it very interesting that there was some denial of this. And I think people are now sort of starting to cotton on to it, even those who are within it, who are now, I think, starting to say, well, yeah, it's pretty much undeniable that there is a community. Whereas they had their moments at VidCon where they wanted to go and sit at the Anita Sarkeesian panel, the now slightly infamous one. And beforehand, it was agreed by the entire group. No one would mention they were going to go to it. No one was going to tweet anything about it or Facebook anything about it. No one was going to say anything when they were at the panel, and they weren't going to try and disrupt anything or do anything like that. So it was all agreed, it was a nice tactical thing, all agreed by everyone before going in there. But there's totally not a community or anything like that. There's no sort of in-group dynamic or anything like that going on there, guys. Honest. But then on top of that, and this is the thing which I find so fucking bizarre, we went in because we just wanted to listen. We didn't want to disrupt anything. Better sit up front as a massive fucking block all together so we can absolutely eye fuck Anita from 2 meters away, because she knows what we all look like. We've all had our faces put out there. Why don't we just sit right there? Really? You thought that was the best way of going in there just to listen? I don't buy that. No, you were sitting there because you wanted... It's kind of like you wanted to be noticed, didn't you? I can't get behind this idea that you were just there to listen for the content, because if that was the case, why didn't you split up? Why didn't you sit nearer the back? Why didn't you take on some sunglasses or a hat or something like that? Why sit up front all together where look, if you're in a convention sitting on a stage, you can see people really easily in the first sort of 3 or 4 rows. You can pick out individual faces really easily. Going back further than that, because you've got the stage lights on, you becomes a lot harder to do. Why pick the most fucking obvious place that you can be seen? I mean, I see it as basically you wanted to partake in a little bit of IRL trolling. You wanted her to know that you were there. Now, does that mean that she should have reacted as she did and done the whole, you're serial harassers and you're terrible people and look at you all there? No. That was unprofessional as fuck, and she absolutely should not have had that reaction to that situation. But I find the idea of you're going into it to be in that exact place and not secretly hoping that there's going to be some sort of reaction, I find absurd. I mean, it's like the idea of walking past your ex-partner's house multiple times in a day. Yeah, legally you're allowed to do that. No one can definitely say that you're doing it for any malicious reason. That's not going to stop a court from slapping a restraining order on you for doing it. Just because you're not technically doing something wrong, it might not even be your intent, but it can still sort of have that impact, and, rightly or wrongly. So just because there's not a legal thing stopping you, and just because you're technically in the right, that doesn't sort of stop it from having that impact. I mean, there's a reason why when 2 people are having a fight and the police show up, they don't sit you next to each other so you can hear what everyone's saying. They pull you several meters apart when they're listening to each side of the story, because they know that they're going to get 2 different fucking stories where each one is the protagonist who didn't do nothing, and they don't want them to be standing next to each other because they'll just blow up at each other again.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I just can't be bothered to follow the whole skeptic fellowship. I know they don't follow me. I'm tiny and insignificant, but I really am concerned about legit. To me, it's not. I'm not part of a community really. Not even MGTOW. A lot of people don't like me in that quote unquote community. I'm very concerned about what's happening in the world right now, in particular in Europe, where I live, and I've lived for 2 decades. I am European. I don't like what's going on, and I foresee because I'm sort of shifting gears here, because ultimately the whole skeptic, whatever you want to call it, I don't see them as consequential. They're not, the culture war. If they were winning the culture war, we wouldn't have things like London Bridge and Manchester and all this stuff. This is just empty rhetoric on the part of Dave and others. And so I'm much more concerned with
one instance to me that they failed with the culture war. Sorry to jump in.
Please.
But because of the whole VidCon reaction thing, it's well, if you want to, if you're winning the culture war and making sure that men and women are being seen as equal, why was it that the panelist who flouted the rules of VidCon had no repercussion whatsoever? Oh, it's because she's a woman. Well, what a fucking surprise. A woman got away with breaking the rules and blowing up at a man. Good job winning that culture war, guys. Good job getting men and women to be seen as equal and to be treated equally. Congratulations. No, to me, that's a pretty fucking obvious sign that no, you're not having any sort of impact. I mean, it's no real surprise that whenever these people are talked about in the mainstream media, it's like, you're white supremacists, you're all racists, you're woman haters. You're not making this change that you think you are. You're operating within your own sphere, and you're always preaching to the choir. Now, I don't consider myself to be immune from that. I'm very aware of that fact. I know I'm just some random fucking nobody on the internet making videos about some shit that I find interesting. I ain't going to change fucking nothing when it comes to the grand scheme of things. I'm completely inconsequential in the world of politics, economics, and all that sort of stuff. So I think there's sort of partly a bit of a delusion of grandeur. Some of these people.
I think it's very safe to say at this stage, I'm sure Sargon's a great guy and he does a nice beard. If hubris is a thing, I think at this stage of the game, he definitely has gotten a big chunk of it. But I think, as I pointed out, more importantly, Nothing has changed in the policies of European countries towards manifestations of peace, these religious, ethnic, self-segregated ghetto communities that are popping up left and right all the time these days. Things are getting worse, not better. Now, to me, that's another sign that the quote-unquote culture war is being lost, because politicians have not changed their tune. That's why I just can't be bothered to pay attention to these people in any great depth beyond some superficial stuff. It's time that we actually talk in a serious manner about something that's really consequential, which is the future of Europe and the individual countries in it, and whether or not we have a right to maintain effectively a cultural hegemony over interloper cultures that historically are not part of the collage and actually ruined what had been a pretty good thing, I think. And that's why, and that's the skeptic community. I mean, I'm sure once it becomes trendy enough, they'll start talking about that too. But I'm concerned about that right now, and have been. And what has changed in terms of the mainstream politics? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It just continues. And I agree with you, well, that we're fast approaching the stage now with Islam to really make the full transition here. And you pointed out in your recent video, it's an aberration.